Thank you very much for joining us today to look at the visibility of women's sport in the UK. I'm Tammy Parler, Chief Exec of the Women's Sport Trust, and this morning we want to do three things with you. We want to share with you our data on the current media exposure, consumption and audience of women's sport in the UK. We want to discuss the opportunities that data presents, and we have an expert panel, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions and respond, and hopefully to inspire all of us to take the action needed to take full advantage of what is really an exciting and growing industry. Briefly, some background on us and our expertise in this area. Visibility is at the heart of who we are as an organisation. We are a national charity that emerged out of London 2012, and it was seeing women's sport both physically at the Olympics and in the coverage in the media and realising it had been absent that drove the ambition and the vision of WST. That's tangible proof that visibility can drive action. Now, we operate under the strapline making women's sport visible, viable and unstoppable. And we do this through focusing on three main areas: promoting diverse role models, increasing media coverage, improving the commerciality, the funding landscape. We convene, we do behind the scenes influencing, we mobilise athlete voice, and we use research and insight to be a catalyst that encourages further development. Now, women's sport won't reach its potential if it's invisible. And over the past 6 months, we've shared a significant amount of insight into visibility with the industry. And specifically, we have 4 things that we can draw on for this discussion. Unlocked, which is our cross-sport programme to supercharge female athletes. Ambition, a strategy for change for the whole sporting ecosystem. Closing the visibility gap, our most recently published research into women's sport visibility, done with 2 circles. And what we'll share with you in a moment are continued work around monitoring the landscape to track the visibility of women's sport in the UK media. All of this means we have a deep understanding of growth patterns, opportunities and blockers that's vital for growing the industry. Let me touch on each of these. Firstly, Unlocked. This is our athlete programme, all about empowering athletes to be visible and connects them to industry leaders. Unlocked came off the back of a recognition that female athletes' platform was growing, but we surveyed them, and the short summary is that it showed that they didn't understand their worth and they weren't prepared to make the most of their platforms. So we created a community of athletes. We gave them the space to understand what they cared about and how they wanted to use that influence. Through our programme, which included group support, webinars, mentorships with industry leaders from across the sports industry, they improved exponentially in every area. They started to be clearer about what they wanted to influence. They improved how they got their messages across, developed a stronger support structure, and became more motivated to stand up on those important platforms as role models. And only 4 months after our inaugural programme ended, 5 of those athletes had already joined sporting boards. Athletes are powerful advocates for change, and their stories are inspiring. Helping female athletes to speak up and be front of centre of conversations helps shape opinion. The other thing I want to say is that there's a great need for more diversity within our industry. Athletes are an exciting talent pool. Given the right support, I honestly believe that they can be the leaders of the future. Now, secondly, last year we held a series of discussions or conversations with 54 leaders from across the industry. Broadcasters, digital platforms, rights holders, brands, government departments, athletes, etc. We asked, what was your vision for women's sport and how can we achieve that? And the Ambition report is a digest of those conversations. It's a comprehensive summary of all the issues and gives an overall strategy for change. It highlights 8 overarching themes, including some significant areas around improving visibility. It touches on the importance of an inclusive media environment, clarifying audience, developing personalities, and much more. It's on our website, and I'd encourage you to download it. It really provides a structure that you can use to grow your organisation, no matter where it is in its development. Lastly, before we look at the latest numbers, our Closing the Visibility Gap research, published in April with 2 circles, includes toolkits for brands, athletes, rights holders and the media on how to improve visibility for women's sport. With the value of women's sport set to treble to 1 billion by 2030, there's clearly huge potential for women's sport, but visibility is still patchy, and there's a lot of opportunity to make fandom deeper and broader. On a really practical level, we're not interested in just describing the issues. We're doing follow-up think tank work and sessions like this that are all about moving stakeholders to action. It's not just about showing more women's sport. Visibility is everybody's responsibility, and there isn't just one answer. Broadcasters need to improve how they're signposting to their own content. Rights holders need to improve their comms activity with media outlets, from how press releases are issued to providing better access and more data on players. There's been some great work to date within women's sport, but the research also highlights the significant challenges. Now, we're continuing to track progress through 2021, and I'd now like to hand over to Emma and Shalina from Futures, who will look at the numbers.
Great, thank you, Tammy. While I get the screen share up, I'll just give a quick intro to Futures. So Futures Sport and Entertainment is a research and analytics agency. We work with quite a few brands, teams and rights holders. We specialize in a few different things. The one we'll focus on today is TV audiences, but we also look at sponsorship valuation and consumer research. So in terms of this presentation, we've been commissioned by Women's Sport Trust to track media exposure and how audiences are doing in the UK for women's sport across the whole year. I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, just 1 second, technical issues. Great, I'm hoping you can all see that now. Great, so throughout this presentation, we'll use a few different terms throughout, so we've just briefly defined them. Those terms are women's, mixed, and men's sport. The reason we've defined this is based on how the data is available in our system and the program names. So there's a kind of few of the key properties here that are used in women's sport, mixed sports, and men's sports. I guess the ones to highlight in particular for mixed sports that really drive that viewership are obviously the Olympics and the Paralympics that will take place, and then Wimbledon as well. So to start, we're just going to go through some kind of overall trends of viewership in the UK. So to start, we're looking at total TV. This is looking back to 2012. As you can see, total TV has been steadily declining since that year. However, the pandemic has kind of halted that viewership. So Q1 and Q2 of last year were particularly high and on an increase. Q3 kind of coincided with some of those restrictions easing, and then also summer months where generally viewership's a bit lower. And then once we went back into lockdowns kind of end of last year and then beginning of this year, viewership then spiked up again a bit and then has gone back down in this most recent quarter, coinciding with the unlockdowns in the UK. If we change that and look for sport instead, it's a bit of a different story. So kind of unsurprisingly peaked in 2012 with the London 2012 Olympics. Since then, it's been declining, but at a slower rate than total TV. And as you can see on the slide from those logos, there's a bit of peaks when we have these big global tournaments. I guess kind of opposite to total TV, there was a big decrease in Q2 of last year with all the postponements. But then since everything has returned, sport viewership has rebounded really strongly. And obviously with the success of the England men's team in the Euros this year, Q2 viewership is particularly high. So switching to look a bit more specifically at women's sport, so the proportion of women's sport audiences out of the total was kind of slowly but steadily growing until 2019, where it peaked, partially driven by the popularity of the Women's World Cup that year. 2020 was a particularly tough year, and that proportion has gone down a bit now. We're obviously tracking this for 2021, and we're hoping with kind of the high profileness of some events that are taking place this year, that percentage will then go back up and continue to grow. And then looking a bit more closely at just women's sport, I guess one of the themes of this presentation is the power of free-to-air coverage. So you can see here from the viewership of just free-to-air, it's particularly high, and kind of similarly to overall sport, but it's a lot more exaggerated for women's sport, is that tournaments really drive that viewership. So you can see the general ones there, and all the peaks coincide with various global or wider ranging tournaments, which generally tend to feature on free-to-air and kind of have that additional reach. And then looking a bit at TV news mentions, which is also one of the things we've been tracking for Women's Sport Trust. So for the first 6 months of this year, 31% of the TV news mentions were for women's and mixed sport. I guess kind of unsurprisingly, the highest numbers were for those 3 news channels. Obviously those being 24-hour dedicated channels, you'd expect that. Because the other positive story from here is that the proportion of mentions for women's sport and mixed sports through the 2 BBC channels, BBC One and BBC Two, are particularly high. So that broadcaster had the highest mention across the other channels when we look at it in terms of proportion. And I guess similarly to viewership, we're hoping that that proportion will increase as the year goes on, given that this data is just till June, so it doesn't include the 100 or the Olympics yet. So our hope is that that will continue to grow. So the next few slides focus on a few of the key events that have happened so far this year. So firstly, looking at Wimbledon, which just took place, there's a couple of things we wanted to highlight. So firstly, we took a look at, in terms of coverage of matches on BBC One and BBC Two. And what was interesting to see was that there were more men's singles matches shown in the early rounds than ladies singles. So once we got to quarterfinals onwards, BBC One and BBC Two showed all of the games. But prior to that, there was a bit of a discrepancy. So there were 7 more men's singles games shown on those linear TV channels. And when we translate that into the audiences for the 2 finals, you can see on that top right-hand chart that the women's final was a bit lower, kind of a potential side effect of not showing some of those games involving those women earlier on, and people have a bit less of an interest. And the bottom half of the slide is kind of a particular story we wanted to highlight. So you might be aware of the Emma Raducanu story from Wimbledon this year. Obviously, she did particularly well and kind of captured the nation with her performances. What was interesting to see was that BBC One primetime game for her 4th round. So that got moved into primetime window on BBC One and performed really well. And that match actually outperformed some of Murray's earlier matches. Generally, from having looked at Wimbledon over the last few years, Murray is a big driver of audiences in the UK. When we translate that to press coverage, it's kind of interesting in that Raducanu is actually the most covered female tennis player. Obviously, with this being in the UK, there's that particular interest. But I guess when we look across the top 15, it's a bit less of a positive story for women. So the second most mentioned one was Serena Williams, and she actually pulled out injured in the 1st round. If we then scroll further down, the other women that made it into the top 15 are kind of lower down, and also Barty, who won and was also quite a good story herself, wasn't that high. I guess we wanted to highlight this story because it kind of shows that while there's great coverage there, some of that women's sport coverage is more around kind of these high profile stories and one-off situations rather than necessarily in the day-to-day coverage of Wimbledon. And then we also wanted to highlight rugby union and rugby league. So I guess this slide here really highlights the power of free-to-air in that the Six Nations women's final aired on BBC Two. When we compare that to the average of the other games from previous years that were kind of across Sky Sports, you can see that that average is much higher on the top left corner, and that's only coming from 1 game, whereas the other years had a few more games shown on TV. When we look at the reach for that game in the bottom left, it's obviously quite high, 1.2 million just from that 1 game. When we compare that with all of the games that aired on Sky Sports in the previous 4 years, it's not that much higher. I guess the interesting stat from there is that 89% of viewers who watched some of that final on BBC Two hadn't watched any Women's Six Nations coverage on Sky before. So really highlighting that power of free-to-air to reach new viewers that either don't have access to Sky or wouldn't have necessarily watched rugby union before, but seeing it on free-to-air meant that they did tune in. And then kind of similarly for rugby league, that Women's Challenge Cup was aired on BBC Two for the first time as well this year. And again, kind of similar story where it was only 1 game, only 2 hours of coverage, but quite a high average audience and hours viewed. For the remainder of the presentation, I'll hand over to my colleague, Emma.
Great, thanks, Shalina. So the next event-specific insight we've got here is the FA Women's Super League. And the top left chart shows its year-on-year growth that it's seen in recent years, both on a coverage perspective and also the audience and how many people are actually watching the property. And this year was actually helped by not only coverage on BT Sport, but also a live match that aired on BBC last August. And we're expecting that to grow for the next season with the new rights deal that's coming up, which means that the property will now air on Sky Sports, as well as a minimum of 18 games to air on BBC. So I guess going back to Selena's point about the power of free-to-air coverage, we're expecting that to have a real impact on this property with that much exposure on free-to-air. And it's not only the live for this property that has seen recent growth and done really well in recent seasons. So the women's football show is the Super League's free-to-air highlight show that airs on BBC, typically on a Sunday evening. And the bottom left panel just shows, is benchmarking that broadcast against other highlights broadcasts of other sports. And you can see that it receives a higher audience than the likes of Premiership Rugby, men's Premiership Rugby on Channel 5, and it's competing with the NFL show also airing on BBC. But in terms of a highlights broadcast for women's sport, the audience that show gets is unrivaled. And moving on to the right-hand side of this slide, this is more focusing on potential growth areas going forward. So one thing we highlighted was something as a growth point is the Super League's ability to create avid fans and regular viewers. One data point we picked up on was that 69% of all women's Super League viewers on BT Sport last season only watched once, only tuned in to watch a game or however much of a game once. And when you compare that to the same stat for the Premier League on Sky and BT Sport, that's at 13%. So a real gap there. And I guess the question remains whether that's a regular time slot needed for fans to be created, or a bit more fan affinity with the teams, and the free-to-air coverage that's going to come next season is only going to help with that 69% going down, and the property's ability to build more fans and more regular viewers. And I guess similar to that, the bottom right looks at TV news, so similar to the overall slide that Selena shared earlier, but just looking specifically at domestic football. And so far this year, 4% of all domestic football TV news mentions has been for women's domestic football. So as I say, we're expecting that with the increase in free-to-air coverage for the live games, that's only going to have a positive effect for other media outlets like TV news, like press exposure. Of course, it's all connected. So especially given how much, as Selena shared, we know that the BBC platforms or the BBC channels generally share more women's sport TV news mentions than others. So that free-to-air coverage on the live BBC is only going to help that figure. So sticking with Super League again, or FA Women's Super League, the left-hand part of this slide, we also looked at benchmarking the overall reach of the Super League this season compared to other men's properties on pay TV. And you can see that just under 1.5 million people watched 3 minutes or more of the Super League on BT Sport last year. And that's higher than Rugby Union Cup competitions on the same channel. And also not far off Premiership Rugby on BT Sport as well. But I think another key thing here is looking at the number of matches in the green circle. So from just 20 matches, the Super League was able to reach 1.5 million people, which is a lot fewer than the number of matches for Premiership Rugby. So highlights the Super League's ability to reach more people from a fewer amount of coverage. So certainly a positive there as well. And finally, on the right-hand side, we looked at segmenting Super League viewers on BT Sport into 4 different distinct categories based on how many times that they're tuning in to watch the property and how long that they're watching for. So this ranges from the very top, people that are watching often, and when they do watch, they're watching for a long time. So I guess you could call them hardcore viewers or already regular viewers of the property, down to people that don't watch very often, and when they do, they don't watch for very long. So more of your incidental viewers. And I think the key thing here is that top segment doesn't make up much of the overall respondents at 17%, but they make up over 2/3 of the overall viewership. So it's this really small core group that is making up a lot of the viewership. And I think the goal going forward, and again, the free-to-air coverage and the new rights deal is only going to help almost increase that segment up from 17%, creating more regular viewers and more avid fans of teams and the property as a whole. So next, moving on to another Super League, but the Netball Super League, and how that fared in its most recent season. So big news for the Super League this year was that Sky Sports aired all live games on both Sky Sports linear TV and also Sky Sports' YouTube channel. And you can see in the top left that had a big effect on the amount of coverage that the property had on linear TV this year, a real increase going back from previous years. And also on the top right, you can see that the YouTube video views were also contributed to like the overall reach of the property at 1.9 million YouTube video views. And another strength of this property is its demographic makeup. Again, moving to the bottom left panel, the proportion of female and 16 to 34 viewers for the Super League on linear TV is a lot higher than other properties on pay TV, the likes of the Premier League, the Super League, and also England cricket on Sky. So a really positive or a strength story for the Super League, and that these are two key target audiences. And finally, on the netball, I guess similar to the FA Women's Super League, another growth area going forward is creating those regular viewers and those avid fans. So again, the same data point showed that 76% of all Netball Super League viewers on Sky only watch once. But I think what's quite interesting is that when we looked at the most watched teams on Sky Sports TV and Sky Sports YouTube, they were different. So that suggests that the addition of YouTube this year is actually helping to combat that, in that it's bringing in more people to the property that ordinarily perhaps hadn't watched on linear TV. And our final event-specific insight is a very early look at the 100 and the Women's 100 specifically. So of course, this is a tournament that's new for this year and still going on. So as I say, this is a very early look at some positive stories that we've seen so far, but there has been some positive stories so far that we wanted to share. So first off, the opening match of the 100 and the Women's 100 specifically aired on both Sky Sports and BBC Two, and it was the most watched women's cricket match in the UK on record, surpassing the two previous highs that were for England women's internationals on both Sky and BBC in the last 12 months. So a really positive story that a women's domestic cricket match can surpass that kind of the international that typically we usually have historically found in the past receives a higher rate of viewership. But not only that, since that game, there's been consistently high audiences for the women's tournament on Sky Sports. And in fact, the game on Monday on Sky Sports, ranked number 8, has made it into this top 10 table for women's cricket. So a really positive story that's not just that opening match that was simulcast on BBC that's performed here. It's been a consistently high audience, and yeah, even just the Sky Sports audiences are getting into this top 10 table for women's cricket in the UK. And secondly, the top right panels shows the impact of the 100 on bringing new viewers, i.e. people that weren't already fans of cricket, into the sport, one of the key aims for the tournament. So here we looked at, of the 4.9 billion people that have watched the Women's 100 so far, 3 million of them had not watched any England women's cricket previously this year, i.e. these are people that hadn't watched any women's cricket so far this year, and i.e. are new people to the sport. So a real positive there, knowing that that's a key aim. And finally, on the 100, we looked at, I guess, one of the key drivers of audiences is various different scheduling factors. So of course, the game so far that's aired on Sky and BBC, that first game, received the highest audience. But actually, there's been some variations when we just look at the Sky audiences as well. And one of the key things there is when the Women's 100 so far has clashed with other men's 100 games or England men's test match v India, there's been a knock-on effect on the audience. But actually on Friday, it was announced that more women's 100 games than initially planned are going to air on BBC. There was a game yesterday, for example, that was added to the list, and that aired on BBC. So we're confident that there'll be more games from the tournament, the rest of the tournament, that we're going to end up adding to that top 10 table on the left, which is obviously great. So rounding all that off, this is just a look at all the peaks that we've seen so far for women's sport in the UK. And you can see that the early peaks this year were for the Women's Football Show, as we mentioned, on BBC, and then the Women's Six Nations final in April, again, which aired on BBC Two. But actually, since the start of the summer, a lot of the peaks, or most of the peaks, have been for cricket. That first one being a Women's ODI on just Sky Sports, and then the next two bigger ones for England Women's International that aired on BBC, and then next, the Women's 100 on both Sky and BBC. And we're expecting a lot more peaks like that for the rest of the year, both from the next Women's 100 games that are due to air on BBC, but also, as we mentioned, the Women's Super League next season that's, as we say, going to have a minimum of 18 matches airing on BBC. So once we've got the same chart for the rest of the year, we're expecting a lot more peaks like that. And then next, this is the same data points, but for mixed sports, acknowledging that they have a real key role in women's sport and exposure for women's athletes. So the early peaks were for the athletics on BBC, but I think the key point here is the consistently high peaks for those big global events that have happened in recent weeks. So firstly, Wimbledon, and then the Olympics so far. And the Olympics is one that we're going to be looking at in more detail in coming weeks, and the representation and exposure of female and male athletes within that, within the UK TV landscape. So just to sum all that up and give you some key takeaways from all that we've just gone through. So as Shalina went through on a macro level, when we look at women's sport TV exposure, going back to 2012, it does still continue to be driven by large global events that generally receive free-to-air coverage, say, for example, the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2019. And looking specifically at Emma Raducanu at Wimbledon, we can see that there's clear interest and exposure for the big moments and the high-profile stories of female athletes, which is obviously great. But the Wimbledon example almost highlights that there's often perhaps a gap in that day-to-day and the less of the higher profile moments. But I think the next 2 points show that there are positives and there has been growth and more to come. So the FA Women's Super League really showcases how far women's sport has come, but both in terms of coverage and audience. And the key thing there is what's to come as well. Speaking about the new rights deal and how much of an impact that's going to have, it shows that there's a lot more to come there. And then finally, the 100 almost shows that already in practice, and highlights that there really is an appetite for the regular domestic women's sport coverage, rather than women's sport exposure having to be confined to those big global sport events. There's a clear appetite for that regular coverage, not only for current fans, but as we say, for new fans as well, or new viewers that could then potentially become fans of the game and for women's sport as a whole. So finally, on that point of new fans, what we've done here is we've projected that the reach for women's sport this year, we're expecting to surpass the peak that we saw in 2019. So of course, as we've discussed, the 2019 peak was driven by, or partly driven by, the FIFA Women's World Cup. So of course, a large global event. But actually, we're projecting here that the peak for this year is going to be driven by that regular domestic coverage for women's sport. So as we say, we've got the 100 that's happening now and continues to go on for the next few weeks, and the new viewers that we expect to come from that. And also the Women's Super League starting later in the year, and the new viewers that we're expecting from that as a result of that regular free-to-air coverage. So really positive signs of what's already happened, but also what's to come for the rest of the year. And that's it from us. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to Ben Smith now, a trustee of Women's Sport Trust, who will be hosting a discussion on what all of that means for the industry.
Thanks so much, Emma, and to your colleague Shalina for some really fascinating and new insights there, which I'm sure will prompt a really interesting discussion. As Emma says, my name is Ben Smith, very proud to say I'm on the board of the Women's Sport Trust, having previously worked in the film industry and then for the likes of the BBC and the Times before starting my own businesses. I'm delighted to say I'm joined today by two of my fellow board members, Zara Al-Qudsi, who's had a really stellar career in all things sport, marketing and commercial, previously working for Sky Sports, Athletics Australia, the Rugby World Cup and the ICC Women's World Cup, and by Chris Hurst, a former colleague of mine at BBC Sport and a sports consultant now and a real digital game changer wherever he's been, whether that's been at the BBC, Nielsen, on the board of the Rugby Football League, or at Whisper. Welcome, guys. So, look, the headline insight there, I guess, is that women's sport is set for record broadcast audiences in 2021, which is hugely positive. Chris, maybe I could start with you. Could you give us some of your key takeaways from some of those figures and slides that we've just been looking at?
Yeah, good morning all, and thanks Ben for the introduction. I think my main thoughts are, although we're still a long way off closing the visibility gap, I think there's lots of reasons to be positive, and after a particularly challenging year for women's sport due to the COVID pandemic kind of last year, it's hugely positive that we're on course for record audiences in 2021. What I think is particularly encouraging is women's sport in the UK has often relied on big international events to drive these audiences, but the emergence of kind of new domestic competitions or new broadcast agreements for the likes of the 100 or for the upcoming WSL season, I think that's a real game changer for women's sport. And if you look ahead to 2022, I think the Women's Euros is going to be absolutely massive. We saw this huge success, obviously, of the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2019. We saw how the Men's Euros kind of gripped the nation. Kind of this summer, if women's sport is able to combine kind of that reach of big major international events with a more regular audience who have become passionate about women's sport, I mean, that's hugely exciting for the industry, and hopefully will encourage not only kind of broadcasters and media to show more women's sport, but will also have the added impact of driving attendances, attracting kind of more commercial investment. It's not one single thing that will drive kind of women's sports audiences. It's a collection of factors. So I'm really excited by that.
Great. All right, just before I bring Zara in, please do ask questions in the chat function on this webinar. We'll be coming on to questions from the audience. So if there's anything you want to ask Zara, Chris, or the guys, Emma and Shalina, who presented so beautifully, then please drop those in, and we'll come back to those a bit later on. So Zara, just coming to you, I know a lot of people on this will have attended the visibility gap that we presented with 2 circles back in April. Are there any learnings from that report that kind of apply to some of these broadcast figures that we've looked at this morning?
Morning. I think nothing new, which is good. I think everything that Shalina and Emma have just talked us through actually just mirror what we saw from that report. So, and as Chris just talked about, with the majority of the coverage and the interest coming in both mixed sex sports, but also major international events. If you looked at, and I'll just throw some of the sort of top line stats from that report, the 4 most followed women's sports from that report are all from mixed international major events: athletics, gymnastics, swimming and tennis. So you've got Olympics, Commonwealth Games, Grand Slams, and we saw that in the Futures report with that cadence. But I think the importance, as Chris said, and actually if you look at the graph of the followed women's sports, that next section down, football, rugby union, rugby league, netball, we've just seen where that's starting to grow now because of the domestic gap that's being filled with a domestic product, whether it's the WSL or the 100 or the increase in the Netball Super Leagues. I think it's encouraging that we're seeing growth in shortening the gap from that report. I think the other thing is that sort of came out in both is this kind of siloed approach or mentality. So I think Shalina talked about people just tuning in maybe to one match, and we definitely saw that in the visibility gap where 44% of fans of women's sports only actively follow one sport, whereas fans of men's sport, 75% of them follow 2 or more. So I think that's an opportunity to how do we leverage that? How do we get people following more than one sport? And equally, 25% of women's sports fans actively follow. The rest are all passive. Now, that's quite a small number. So there's obviously an opportunity for growth there. But I think it also demonstrates where you need to have more frequent visibility to engage passive engagement as well. And again, the 100's a great example of, I think, by giving you something in between England women's internationals, you're more likely to get a passive viewer that hopefully becomes an active engagement later on.
Yeah, makes sense. And look, I guess you mentioned 100 there, Zara, which is obviously great to see some of those initial figures and that it is making the impact that we hoped and that it would. I mean, it's been great to see the visibility in terms of broadcast on free-to-air and also in stadium. I just wondered what inspiration other domestic leagues and sports might be able to take from that, particularly the likes of the Women's Super League and the Allianz Premier 15s. Are there insights and lessons that can be learned from the impact the 100 has made?
Oh, I think definitely. And thankfully and very helpfully, Isabel Westbury has basically written my answer for this morning on the BBC Sport website, where she's outlined what the 100 has done so brilliantly for women's cricket and not just cricket. I think she's given the example as a journalist that media opportunities, they've always been given male and female players. Whenever there's been an opportunity, the fact that promotional materials have carried both male and female players, I think there's probably been a couple of opportunities may have come about because of the last year we've been in. So the force need to have the double header schedule, but I would add that I think they've done a brilliant job of actually equal billing. So the double headers have been double headers, but the women's game has not been a starter or a afterthought of the men's game. But then I think an observation Isabel makes, and I'd agree with, it means that the commentators are doing both. So you start to build male advocacy. Michael Boyne and Nasser Hussain are brilliant advocates of the women's international game anyway, but now you're having people like KP commenting on the women's domestic game. And I think sometimes we underestimate the importance of male advocacy. I was just actually flicking through the participants on this call, and it's hard to know because I don't know whether Charlie or an Ali is a male or a female, but there's probably about 8% of the people on this call are men. And yet if you look at the broader industry, the last UK Sport report showed that 40% of UK Sport and Sport England boards are female. So it can't just be that only women on this call are making a change in women's sport. So I think that's a job that needs to be done, that I think the 100 has done very well, whether it's their boards, their clubs, or even the players just following each other and building that support and that interest, because that does also bring over people that are fans of men's sport into women's sport as well. And I think the final thing, which I do actually think the WSL obviously already have more than the 100 did to start with, is that having that one brand. You are a fan of the Oval Invincibles, not of the men's team and the women's team, just as you are a fan of Man United or you're a fan of Arsenal. And I think the learning from the 100 would be is how do you tap into that more? Because I think, the men's football clubs have obviously got a long history of building advocacy and fan engagement. How do they now tap into that to build that around their women's teams bigger as well?
Great. Thank you, Zara. Chris, I'm keen to get your thoughts on the 100 and just how digital perhaps can tap into that as well.
Yeah, I mean, from a broadcast perspective, I think it's been a great example, as I think that the WSL will be, of the importance of kind of combining free-to-air broadcast with a pay TV broadcaster. Like BBC and Sky have played really important but probably quite different roles in the promotion of the competition. So I think that's been key. I mean, looking more broadly at how domestic kind of leagues are covered, I think the Netball Super League is a great example of actually free-to-air coverage doesn't necessarily need to rely on the likes of the BBC. Free-to-air coverage can be using social platforms like YouTube to build an audience, which I think is exciting. I think domestic kind of competitions do need to look at how they can use digital platforms to build an audience and justify why they kind of get greater exposure. Not every competition like the 100 is going to start off with live free-to-air coverage on the BBC. I think it's been interesting watching the evolution of the WSL journey, both with its own OTT product through the FA Player, but also obviously the coverage that BT Sport provided, but also the fact that games was shown on the BBC, on the Red Button and the BBC Sport kind of website. They've demonstrated the audience interest and now are rewarded with that free-to-air exposure on BBC One and BBC Two from next season. I think the other kind of big takeaway for me from the 100 is just discovering kind of people beyond the international stars. So, I mean, I'm a huge fan of women's cricket. Have been involved in the women's game since I worked kind of for the ICC. But there's lots of stars and players that I've discovered kind of during the course of this competition who I might have heard of but never seen play. And so that's now inspired me to go and follow them on their social media accounts, learn a little bit more about them. And I don't think you always need to have affinity with teams. Affinity with athletes and caring about their stories, I think, is really important. I think during Wimbledon, kind of Emma Raducanu was just an amazing example of how somebody who wasn't that well known built a huge kind of social media following, adding hundreds of thousands of followers. Like, if the WSL, the 100 and other kind of domestic sports, be it rugby union, netball, rugby league, can build interest in players beyond the international team as well and encourage people to follow them on their social media accounts, that just creates lots more kind of commercial opportunities. So you don't just as a brand have to sponsor a team or a league or a club, but you can also have an involvement with an individual athlete as well.
Okay, thanks, Chris. We're seeing a few questions coming in already, and please keep them coming into the chat area, which talk about the importance of a mix between free-to-air and paid TV for visibility. But I'm interested to understand a bit more about that on big websites, Chris, and kind of digital media coverage around women's sport and the visibility of it. Can you talk a bit about, the impact of the likes of the BBC Sport website, Sky Sports, and the research I know you've been doing into that area about the impact that can make?
Yeah, I mean, the Two Circles Closing the Visibility Gap report that we released earlier this year showed that broadcast remains the key way in which people will discover women's sport, but don't underestimate the power of digital platforms to provide that exposure, particularly in providing that kind of cross-platform support on both websites and social media for competitions like the 100 and the WSL. Although our research that we've presented today is primarily focused on broadcast, as you say, Ben, we are looking at kind of both digital platforms like BBC Sport, The Telegraph and The Guardian and Sky in terms of what prominence they give to women's sport on a daily basis. And at the moment, many of those leading websites, less than 1 in 10 of their top stories each day relate to women's sport. So there's still lots of work to be done to have greater gender parity when it comes to digital platforms. We're also continuing to look at kind of governing bodies, leagues and their social media profiles, because I don't think governing bodies can really be in a position to criticise the media for lack of coverage when, if you look at their own digital profiles, again, as our Closing the Visibility Gap report showed, that there's still lots of opportunity for greater kind of gender parity in coverage on their own social media profiles. We're going to be looking to release kind of more of that digital data kind of during the course of the year, because I think it's really important to consider all the different component parts to making kind of women's sport not only visible but also commercially viable as well.
Sure. Okay. We're going to come on to the last question, and then we're going to open it up and pick out some of the questions that are coming in. Zara, I just wanted to ask both you and Chris, if there's one thing you could change around the visibility of women's sport over the next 12 months, what might that be? Chris, then I'll come on to you and ask you the same question.
I don't think change. I think just more seeing the tide continue to rise. And that's everyone's job to do. I did chuckle. I read Alex Wallace's comment in the chat about not advocating Piers Morgan, but I think that's a brilliant example that, you need everything to go up. And, that Emma Raducanu, we've talked a lot about her. I think the stuff that Emma and Shalina talked around, the sort of increased TV viewership, but also, she was the #1 female player from Wimbledon in terms of print media coverage as well. Like, who's driving what? And I don't think that's actually an answer, but if everyone is doing it, it all continues to rise up. So I think it's just, I think that's what I'd like to continue to see, that tide for change, whether it's media, print media, broadcast, athletes, agents, brands, everyone collectively plays a part in increasing the visibility of women's sport.
Okay, thanks, Zara. And Chris?
Yeah, I suppose building on Zara's point, I think incremental growth in women's sport will happen inevitably. Like, the tide is moving in that direction. What I'd love to see is that tide to move even faster. So I'd love to see what can be done collectively, again, from all the different stakeholders that Zara listed, to accelerate that change. I think when ambitious broadcasters, governing bodies, brands come together, there's already some exceptional examples of where change has happened, and quite dramatically. Like, who would have thought that there would be crowds of 5 figures watching women's domestic cricket kind of 5 years ago? The 100 has allowed that to be created. So I suppose my wish is to see that ambition accelerate the rate of change, because as Zara says, no single party on their own can achieve visibility and viability. As we say at the women's sport, when you combine those two together, women's sport becomes unstoppable. So we'd love to see parties leading that change, rather than just relying on the audience to follow.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, guys. Some really fascinating insights. And we're going to move on to questions now. I want to bring Emma and Shalina back in. Now, just one that jumps out from Jenny Mitten there. She asked, how can we balance the reach of free-to-air with the benefits of Sky around big campaigns, premium perception? I guess that's long been a challenge for sports across the board, the commercial benefits of accepting potentially bigger deals with the likes of Sky versus the reach of free-to-air. Zara, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the blueprint, or the for that answer, is the Big Bash in Australia, because they showed with the men's and the women's format that having built a great product on pay TV and then split the rights between Fox and Channel 9, it then also drove ticket sales. So I think it's a blend of the two, but I also think that you can't underestimate the importance of the role a Sky Sports or a BT plays in raising the bar in production. And the work that Sky Sports has done on cricket for the last decade plus has sort of set the benchmark of what we all now as consumers expect to see when we watch cricket. And that sort of then forces what BBC then have to deliver. I'm not saying BBC do a wonderful job in all their rights as well. So I think it's not always as easy as just saying money for pay TV versus eyeballs for free to air, because there are benefits of both. And I think the WSL, have got a brilliant blend of that with their new rights. It'll be really interesting to see how they manage to make the most of that. But I think cricket's led the way quite well so far in finding that middle ground.
Great, thanks, Zara. There's another one here which talks about video on demand and the power of documentaries and great storytelling. How has that improved or affected sport in the UK over the last year? And do we have any insights on how documentaries around sport versus men's sport stack up and their potential effect on growing the game? Chris, I don't know if that's something you could touch on.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to storytelling and the importance of storytelling in making you care. So I think live has a really important role to play. Highlights have a key role to play, but making you care about the personalities and the opportunity to get in depth around great human interest stories or incredible feats of athleticism. I think that there's a role there. I also think it's the different types of stories that you can tell. There will be some avid fans who want to know everything about kind of the athletic side of the sport and the skill on the field of play, but there are others who want to be brought in by kind of different stories. So I think trying to understand which different segments of fans are trying to reach with different stories is really important. Kind of working out the right partners that you want to work with to tell those stories, and also telling those stories in an appropriate way for kind of different channels and different platforms as well. The exciting thing of the storyteller in 2021 is there's so many different options. It's trying to then get the balance between not only investing in the production to tell those stories, but also then in having a marketing plan to get those stories to the audiences that you want to reach. So building on Zara's last point, I think where the likes of Sky and BT and others of the pay TV channels play a brilliant role is in marketing kind of women's sport, because they just have those budgets available that often free-to-air channels don't have available. So it's a complex mix of lots of different factors, and it's hard. If it was easy, I think that we might be able to show much kind of better kind of visibility figures, but it is difficult, and that's why we talk about the importance of partnerships, not on a single organisation be able to deliver the change on their own.
If I may just add to that, Chris, I think just an observation with my Formula One hat on, excellent question, because there's no doubt that Drive to Survive, which is Formula One's documentary series on Netflix that tells the sport away from the track, albeit it tells the championship story, has led to an increased TV viewership that we've now got this year. My own friend of 20 plus years now follows the results of Formula One because she's obsessed with Daniel Ricciardo since she's watched Drive to Survive. Yet I've tried to get her to a Grand Prix for the last 4 years and she's not interested. So, I think it's a great question, and hopefully we start to see more non-live and more VOD coverage of women's sport, because I think the irony being we've always, and we all know that the stories in women's sport are phenomenal, and actually there's some brilliant stories there, but now we need to be able to craft those stories to supplement the on-pitch and on-pitch action.
Great. Thank you both. Emma and Shalene, I've got a couple of questions here for you, which we'll squeeze in before the end. Just the first one, very quickly, question WSL data and whether that includes audiences from the FA player.
Thanks, Ben. No, so that data we showed was just linear TV, and that was across the whole presentation, excluding the specific Sky Sports YouTube data. So no, it's that's another big part of the story that we've kind of touched upon, is the digital side of things and how much that is growing. But no, it didn't include that. It was just linear TV.
Okay, and Emma, one for you here. I know Chris touched upon this as well. It's around following athletes rather than teams. And is there a trend, this is from Bailey Knight, is there a trend by women's sports fans to follow athletes individually rather than teams? And if so, do we know why that might be?
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think Chris has already touched on it, and our deck kind of highlights in Emma Raducanu that there perhaps is that trend, that it's those big moments, or of course really positive that her rise in popularity almost came from nothing, and she got this huge following and huge interest overnight, it felt like. So I think there absolutely is that trend, and as we showed with the Wimbledon, it's almost, of course that's a positive, but then it's, as we say, it's the day-to-day, or there's other people that are perhaps getting neglected that don't have that big showcase moment. So the day-to-day reporting of, say, female Wimbledon tennis players, or even the likes of Ashley Barty, who of course went on to win the ladies singles, and you compare that to Djokovic, albeit maybe not a fair comparison given that his success over many years, but there's still that gap there. So yeah, I think I would agree that there is a tendency, but as we've said, the more regular domestic coverage is only going to help with that. Not that we want to get rid of that, but it just, while we want those kind of athletes to have that interest, it's also about having more long-term regular interest, not just in those big showcase moments that can come with that one-off athlete interest.
Great, thank you, Emma. Lots of questions we're not going to have time to get to, unfortunately, but look, we really appreciate everyone being so engaged and sending those in. So just so we can wrap up on time, I'm going to hand back now to Tammy. Oh, Tammy, you're on mute.
And I was just saying lots of thanks to you as well. So you've missed all of that. No, just a massive thank you to all of you, the trustees, for being part of the panel, to Zara, to Chris, and to yourself, Ben, and to Futures for the amazing research that you're doing. We, as a charity, we want to push the industry forward. If this has been helpful to you, please let us know. We all have a responsibility to move women's sport forward. Women's sport won't reach its potential if it's invisible. Please go onto our website, download the information that we have there on closing the visibility gap, the ambition report. Let's all move the industry forward. There's been so much information today in this session, and I just want to highlight that it'll be available on our YouTube channel later today. So please look out for that. We'll send that link out across Twitter as well. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And again, please let us know what's been helpful to you and what else we can do to push the industry forward. Thank you.